Hello, everybody. As Ian said, my name is Adam Tinworth. I was indeed a business journalist by background. I started my career working for a trade publication called The Publican for the pub trade, which clearly was very, very hard work indeed, particularly at Christmas time when all the freebies from the breweries and the distilleries would arrive. Apologies to any of you who are teetotal, but that would be a different industry to work in if you were. And then I spent a few years writing about hotels and restaurants for a magazine of that name. Nearly a decade writing about commercial property for a magazine called Estates Gazette, which of the three I've just talked about is the only one that still survives. The other two's demise was nothing to do with me, honest. But in the background to that, I started getting involved in the internet in the late 90s. In fact, the magazine I was working for, Estates Gazette, they launched their website paywalled, in fact, in 1996. And that was sort of earning decent money online by the turn of the century. But in back down to that, I've been involved in various online communities, mailing lists, the very early days of forums or Usenet groups, for those of you who are old enough to remember those on the internet. And that led to me discovering things like blogging around 2001, and eventually to me taking on a full-time digital development role at the company I was working for at the time called Read Business in 2006. And really that was the beginning of my work in what we now call audience engagement. Audience engagement is incredibly important for lots of reasons. Back when I started there, we didn't call it audience engagement. We usually called it community management or community engagement or something like that. But audience engagement is the current vogue term. It tends to shift over times. The sort of job roles that have evolved in this space are things like community manager, community editor, social media editor was a big one for a long time. And nowadays audience engagement is the trendy one, although it's slightly confusing because a lot of theatres and places like that also use the phrase audience engagement. There are crossover, but it's not exactly the same thing. Actually, right now, audience engagement is probably more important than it's ever been. Even before the current situation, the COVID crisis, good audience engagement people were thin on the ground. I often talk to sort of former students who work in audience engagement roles as people at the Metro, at the Sun, at the Eye, at the most of them at senior audience engagement and social media team at the Telegraph are former students, people at the World Economic Forum. And they're always struggling to recruit because there aren't a lot of people with this core group of skills. The reason it's come into real focus over the last couple of months is that most journalism businesses are using a combination of three principal revenue types to sustain themselves. They're using advertising, they're using events, or they're using what we often call reader revenue, i.e. paywall, membership, anything like that. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis has pretty much taken off two of those three legs of the stool, if you like. Clearly, paid events are a difficult business right now because getting people together in a room, tricky. There has been some success in moving some of those businesses over to online, but it's very early stages and the cost benefits are up in the air. Advertising has disappeared dramatically from a lot of places. Even just this morning, I saw that the Guardian's announces laying off something like 120 people, including 70 of those being journalists, and that's just purely because revenue has disappeared. Largely ad and event revenue has just disappeared out of their business. The thing that's growing is audience revenue, is memberships, paywalls, things like that. Places like the New York Times, they've had the ability of to grow that faster than the other things have declined. So they're doing very well. The Guardian obviously hasn't quite managed to achieve that balance. That's life. But at the heart of audience revenue is this audience engagement. If you want people to keep paying you money, you need to build a relationship with them. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. At the core, though, why are we here talking about something like audience engagement? Well, it's because people tend to believe in pixie dust. What do I mean by pixie dust? Well, This is possibly because I have got two young daughters who are going through a small obsession with the Tinkerbell films at the moment. But what we often find occurs in most publishing businesses of various sorts is that people create copy, and then they'll go to the audience engagement team or the SEO team or the social media team, and they'll essentially say, could you sprinkle your pixie dust on this for me? Could you take what I've already created and magically make it fly so it finds an audience? And that's the problem, that we're taking stuff that's already been produced and trying to find an audience for it, rather than thinking about the audience right at the beginning of the process. And that seems like a weird thing to say, that we don't think about the audience. But it's actually quite hard in a lot of journalism businesses to think about the audience, because up until relatively recently, in historic terms anyway, we haven't had good information about the audience. In print, it's very hard to get good analytics about what people read. I mean, short of having a little drone that hovers over people's shoulders, which actually looks at them as they read something, you can't tell exactly what people read in print. Now, I'm sure Zuckerberg's working on that drone even as we speak, but up until now, people have used things like market research. The big challenge of market research in journalism is people lie. They don't necessarily do it intentionally, but people lie about what they read, because if you're a nice, smartly dressed market research person saying, what did you read in the latest issue? You tend to lie upwards. You tend to just naturally, human psychology is very important to everything we talk about today, by the way. Naturally, human psychology, you want to impress, you tend to lie upwards about the quality of what you read. Actually, in all honesty, probably most of us lie to ourselves. We probably spend less time reading good quality journalism than we like to admit, and more time reading the more ropey end, shall we say politely. So this is the challenge, that people want to be able to just do stuff, which is their instinct for them to do, have somebody do magic on it to make it work for search or social, and ta-da, numbers turn up, people come to the site. Because business models are still in some way largely dependent on people actually turning up, reading what you've written. Whether that's because they're members and you just need to keep them coming back to the site as members. If they don't keep coming back to the site, eventually it's going to be time for them to renew their subscription, and they're going to look at it and go, how much have I read over the last month? Should I? No, actually, maybe I'll put the credit card away and maybe I won't pay back for another month. So that's one reason. Or if you're still an ad-driven model, you need people to get to the site. So we're not saying that working on building an audience isn't important. We're just going to talk about when's the right time to think about that and how it interacts with the rest of your journalism. So what do I mean by not pixie dust? There are the major routes that most people get to websites these days are social media. That's largely been the biggest one for much of the last decade or so. It has been challenged in recent years because actually there's one site that is pretty much dominant for most publications in terms of social media and driving traffic, and that's Facebook. And when Facebook made a major change to its algorithm a couple of years ago in the light of the accusations around manipulation of elections in the States and here, they made a dramatic change to their algorithm that reduced the amount of traffic to most news sites. We tend to call it the Facepocalypse in audience engagement circles, because the effect on traffic was that bad. It was an apocalypse. It literally destroyed some businesses. Some businesses that were totally dependent on Facebook traffic, they were gone. They couldn't recover from it. That traffic's largely recovered, but because of that, we've seen a real resurgence in search, which is going to be one of our focuses today. Search traffic has become more important again, and people are spending much more time focusing on their search engine optimization. But beyond that, it also includes elements of content strategy about actually thinking about the content we produce, why we produce it, and what its role is. We're not going to go too deep on that today, but it is an important element of audience engagement, because a lot of businesses are still a little bit on from what we call shovelware, which is where you take exactly what you were doing in print and shovel it onto the web. Now, you'd think after over 20, 25 years of the web, we'd be a bit further on than that, but it's not always the case. And there's sometimes some rethinking to be done. Analytics, we're not going to talk much about that today, unfortunately, but analytics are hugely important to this. The real advantage of digital journalism is you can genuinely see what readers do, not what they tell you they do, but what they actually do. And that can tell you a lot about the success or failure of your content. And you need to understand platforms. I'll look at some figures a little bit later on about where people are and what they are reading, but most people spend most of their online time, if you like, on some of the social media platforms, be that Facebook, be that LinkedIn, be that TikTok, be that Snapchat, be that Twitter, be that Instagram. If you don't understand these platforms and how they relate to where your audiences are, you're not going to find those audiences. And yes, multimedia is part of it. The web is genuinely a multimedia environment. We're still, as an industry, not brilliant at multimedia. What we tend to do is multiple monomedia. What do I mean by that? We tend to do an article over here, a photo gallery over there, a video over there, rather than integrating them all into one package or thinking about the different ways the same story can express through different media. So this is one of the reasons why we're short on audience engagement people. These are quite a complex set of skills. So another way to describe it would be the core planks, if you like, of audience engagement are analytics, to understand readers, their behavior, and the success or failure of what you're doing. Platforms are where you're going to go out and find readers. Some people are going to come to your site direct. They are your loyal readers. They are not a huge proportion of your readers, but they are there. Everybody else you're going to find through a platform of some sort, be that Google search, be that Facebook, be that Twitter, etc., etc. Community management. Skill of managing people, of understanding people, of bringing people together in a way that feels like a community. It's become increasingly important. I had a student of mine come back to give a talk to some of my students I lectured to at City a few years ago. And she said, yes, she would come and do it as long as she got a coffee with me afterwards. I was like, okay, why? And with coffee, and she wanted to pick my brain about sort of some of the basic community management skills that essentially have been neglected in her work for the last 2 or 3 years, because she'd gone off and worked somewhere where the entire focus was on essentially promoting content through Facebook. Her new role involved, for one of the national newspapers, in fact, involved setting up groups within Facebook. So still in Facebook, but she had to set up groups, nurture, grow, and manage that community. And so the community management skills were a critical part of her job. And also being able to experiment. Audience engagement is a new field. It's a growing field. Nobody has all the answers, and more to the point, the answers are not necessarily going to be the same for every publication. In the earlier part of my career in this space, some of the biggest disasters we had were when we just tried to take a success here and reapply it there. So, for example, when I was working for Reed, which was a lot of trade business type publications, we already had a very, very successful forum, so a discussion forum on Farmers Weekly. We rolled that out to Community Care, went brilliantly. We rolled this out to ISIS, which was their chemicals price reporting business. Tumbleweeds. 3 or 4 months, the community editor worked hard to try and get discussion going on that site. Tumbleweeds. Eventually, we turned to the community and said, why are you not using this forum? And they said, oh, we're not allowed to. I said, what do you mean you're not allowed to? Well, there's lots of legislation about what we can and can't say in public because we deal with chemicals pricing. Therefore, any communication we do has to be in hidden places. Like, okay. So forum, bad idea. They're like, yeah, pretty bad idea. So that ability to experiment and learn and not just roll out the same idea everywhere. What works for your community? Again, psychology. We're going to keep coming back to this psychology element of it. What works for the people you are trying to reach? What do they care about? What do they think about? And then you stick all of those together, among them all together, and you get audience engagement. I'd now like to take a little bit of a step backwards, because to really understand audience engagement and what's going on with it, you need to understand 2 of the principal concepts that underlie everything we do on the internet, and they both start with A, luckily. And first of all, we have to think about what the web has done to content, fundamentally. It's all the fault of this gentleman on the screen here, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And he invented the web. The web and lots of different things. The internet's the sort of the big system. Web is a sort of thing that travels over it. Doesn't really matter for our context. He invented the web when he was working at CERN, the particle physics research facility over in Switzerland. And he invented it because he noted a problem that people kept coming to run experiments using the particle collider there. And they would run into the same problem previous research groups had run into, and they spent a couple of weeks solving those problems. But that learning was not being transferred well between research groups. And he looked at this computer on his desk, which was something called a Next Cube. It was the computer that Steve Jobs did between his 2 spells at Apple. I thought there must be some way I can use this computer and this internet thing it's connected to make this easier. And at the time, if you wanted to read something on the internet, you could do, but you didn't just open a browser and go to a web page. You had to open some software called a FTP client and actually connect to a server and download a file to your computer and then open it in Word or something like that. It was a laborious process. And he came up with the idea of what we know as the web, just to solve that problem. And it was called the web because his big insight was you can make this more useful by making links interactive. Again, we're all familiar with links now. It's a fundamental building block of the web. But that was his big innovation. You can make text more useful. You can make it hypertext by allowing people to click on links to see more information. And he just stole that idea from scientific publishing, or academic publishing, I should say. You know, every time you refer to other people's work in an academic paper, you have to cite that work. Use normally a reference and then it directs you to the end of the article. Well, that's clearly much more efficient if you can just click on it and open the article it's referring to. And that's why he built the web. But those links have an impact. It basically means that any form of structure we impose on our journalism doesn't really exist. It's a fiction for our own sense of happiness, if you like, because where most people arrive on your website is an individual page. If you think about the big traffic sources, search sends people generally to individual web pages, not to the home page, to an individual article. Social, ditto. People share articles. They don't share the front page of the website. And when you think about other forms of engagement like newsletters or links from other sites, they all tend to drive people to individual articles. A few years back, the New York Times did a big internal innovation report. You know, they've been very good at being ahead of the game on digital for a long time. And one of the things that was highlighted in their innovation report was that only a third of our readers ever visit it. And those who do visit are spending less time. Page views and minutes spent per reader dropped by double-digit percentages last year. They're talking about the homepage of the New York Times. It's less important than you might think, because most people do not type newyorktimes.com into their browser, go straight there. They come there via links, they come via search, they come there via newsletters. Only about a quarter of people these days go directly to the homepage of a site. This sometimes leads people to talk about the death of the homepage. I love it when I go to a journalism conference and somebody stands up and says something like, "Ah, the homepage is dead," because I can just switch off and stop listening to them because they're clearly a bozo. It's what I call a bozo test. The homepage isn't dead. It's just not the place most people arrive. It's very often the second place the people arrive on your site. They'll come into an individual article, they'll go to the homepage. Very common. But if you're not very good at structuring your pages so there's always somewhere next for somebody to go after they've read an article, then they just tend to go to the homepage and have a look around. So it's very often the second page you visit. That sort of menu, oh, I like that article, I want to find something else, I go to the homepage. It's a menu for me. That tends to work very well. So a title like The Telegraph, for example, we still get a lot of homepage traffic. If you look at their homepage design, it's much more akin to a menu with lots of different places you can go, lots of options, and they actively manage that. They move that around very fast during the day, so there's always something different when you go there. So death of the homepage is not really what this is about. The homepage is still there. Its role changes. People don't arrive at the homepage, go to a section page, find an individual article. They come to an individual article. What we're actually talking about is something which rather pretentiously we call content atomization. What does that mean? What that means is that basically every article you publish in digital is more important than something in print. Why do I mean that? Because it has to find its own audience. You cannot rely on the homepage to deliver you an audience. You cannot rely on the sheer fact of people actually already having the newspaper or magazine and browsing through it to deliver you an audience. You have to sell it on search, on social, through a newsletter. You have to get people to that story in some way. I go back to the pixie dust at the beginning. If you don't have a concept in your head of how and why somebody is going to come across your article, you're probably going to struggle to get it read unless you're lucky. Essentially, to misquote the film, build it and they will not come. You need an engagement strategy. You need to think and take responsibility for finding an audience for your content. Otherwise, it will just sit there on a server somewhere with nobody ever reading it. So that's thing one, atomization. It's a really important idea. It underlies everything we're going to talk about as we go through. The other thing is the other A is summed up here. So here's a cognitive psychologist writing in the year I was born, 1971, and very nicely predicting the situation we find ourselves in 48 years later. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. So basically all he's saying is that if you have abundant information, which is exactly what the internet has done to us, it's given us more information than most of us can ever probably process. In the earlier days of my career in the sort of late 90s, I used to get on trains and come to places like Newcastle and come there and profile the commercial property market there. I have to advise you, never go out drinking with Newcastle commercial property agents. It's not good for your health, liver, or ability to function the next day. But yeah, I'd go to King's Cross in London, I'd get on a train, I'd buy a newspaper and a magazine to read on the way up. And if I got to halfway up the country and I'd read the newspaper and the magazine, what did I do? And so I asked a group of people, say, get your phone out. So I go, I've got my phone out. What'd you do? Read the web. No, 1997. I'm lucky to even get WAP. I could play Snake on it, but that's about it. Go, oh, get your laptop out. Okay, laptop out. Connect to Wi-Fi. 1997, no Wi-Fi on trains. Wi-Fi's barely been invented yet, in fact. And like, oh, you could run out of things to read. Yes. We can't anymore. I don't know about you, but I live in dread, back in the days when we actually flew places, I live in dread of opening my laptop in an airport, because quite often I've opened that. Every single page of the 200 tabs I've got open has turned into an airport Wi-Fi login page, and all those tabs I've been saving to read disappear. We have overwhelming amounts of information now, so we are no longer information scarce, we are attention scarce. And every single one of us is finding different ways of managing our attention. Interestingly, he cites two different, actually no, it's not this one, it's the next quote. People have discovered this attention crisis and rediscovered it every few years. This is a quote from Fred Wilson, who is a very successful venture capitalist in the States. He's invested in many of the big name social platforms that you're probably using, even as we speak. Writing very much in 2005, as you'll tell. So where does the attention come for the next wave of blogs and web services? From the old ones, I guess. In my case, it's not going to come from either my family's attention allocation or my firm's. So attention is a zero-sum game, and if we are creating at an exponential rate more uses of attention, then we are facing a looming attention crisis. Now, this is 2005 he's writing. Facebook exists, but it's only for the elite American universities at this point. Twitter is still a year away. It's still a podcasting startup called Audio. LinkedIn exists. LinkedIn exists for a couple of years, but nobody's paying any attention to it yet. That won't come for another 3 years. So this is actually before a lot of the big attention grabbing. Instagram isn't there. YouTube's just starting up. This was even before all the big attention grabbing services were starting up. But he was right. A couple of years later, a PR man, Steve Rubel for Edelman, wrote, "The attention crisis is an epidemic. There's no more room at the inn. People will cut back. The key question is, what will they trim? Ad-supported media or content from peers?" It's a very PR-y thing to think. "Some will crave the media's ability to edit. Others will want to stay closer to their friends. What's unmistakable is the choices will have to be made." This was actually quite an insightful thing for 13 years ago, in the sense that want to stay close to their friends. Many of us are essentially using our friends as attention filters for us. That's what Facebook and other services are basically doing. They're using algorithms based on top of what our friends and the people we're following are sharing, and they're filtering that through for us. What we've tested less well is the media's ability to edit. And that's one of the interesting things that happened in the last couple of years in the audience engagement front, the real boom in newsletters. Newsletters are fabulous as an audience engagement form because they are an edited form. You choose what goes in there. The real market leader in this a few years back was Quartz, the American business news site, that came out with a morning briefing that drops into your inbox incredibly early. It hits about 6 a.m. But they'd done their research, they'd done their audience research. They knew that their core audience of city traders were waking up at between 5 and 6 a.m. And the first thing they were doing was grabbing their phones and going, "What the hell happened in the markets overnight? I need to know before I get to work." And so they delivered this highly curated newsletter experience that dropped into people's inboxes at 6 a.m., which gave them exactly that. And the real advantage of a newsletter over the web as a whole is you can finish it as a reader. I've tried finishing the web. It doesn't end well. But you can finish a newsletter, and that's a really important psychological construct, because if you finish a newsletter, you feel you've caught up, you're up to date. And so the genius of this newsletter was people were arriving at their desk feeling that they caught up. Really smart piece of audience engagement work. So this is the second concept. These two things, atomization. Every single article you publish has to find its own market. Also, attention. There are overwhelming amounts of content coming at people. How do you stake out a claim? How do you find a piece of that attention? What's interesting is, so this is a piece of research from the most recent Reuters Institute Digital News Report, came out about a month ago. You can download it from the website. They had a look at where people found their news. So about 28% went straight to websites, 26% getting it from social media, 25% via search, then mobile alerts, aggregators, things like Apple News or Flipboard or things like that next. And lastly, email, small but growing. It's even more dramatic when you look at the Gen Z cohort, where you're seeing very, very few of them are going directly to news sites. They're finding it via social media. They're finding it via search. They're finding it by mobile alerts, aggregators, and email. I think you see the breakdown. They're much more likely to take it directly from social media than slightly older cohorts are. And so this is really the reason why audience engagement, search engine optimization, social media understanding are so important, because that's where you're going to find your readers. Now, journalism is not an abstract art. Journalism is a service performed for the reader. Journalism's value is measured in almost real time, in the time, how does it impact people? Does it inform people? Does it change how people think? It's not like, say, art, where you can be an incredibly successful artist, but only posthumously. You can paint wonderful paintings, starve in your garret, and then have your art found after your death. Nobody really finds journalism 50 years on and goes, "Oh, this was brilliant journalism in retrospect." No, it's performed for an audience in its moment. And if you're not looking for an audience, why are you doing journalism? Which brings us to search. Now, search is one of these things that's incredibly important, but keeps changing. And it keeps changing because the environment around it keeps changing. You know, digital may be 20 to 30 years old at this point, but it's still relatively young in inverted commas. The dynamics around it change. And actually search has changed really dramatically over the past 4 or 5 years for reasons I'll talk about in a bit. But again, I'm just going to wind back in time because we've got limited time today. I am unashamedly going to talk pretty much exclusively about Google. Google is not the only search engine in the world. Depending on where you are writing for, some other search engines might be nearly as important. So, for example, for Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, Yandex is incredibly important. Clearly, Baidu is very big in China. And there's a search engine called Nava, which is quite big in Korea. But outside those places, you know, Google is so dominant as to almost not be worth talking about other search engines. I mean, there's Bing from Microsoft, which is almost a rounding error in most people's analytics. A few years ago, journalism.co.uk held a regular conference, most recently online, obviously, called News Rewired. But a few years back, it was held in Microsoft's offices in Victoria in London. I remember walking in one morning and seeing a big neon sign saying Bing with half a dozen completely empty chairs underneath it. So I grabbed my phone, took a picture, shared it to Twitter, Bing user group meeting. That did very nicely for me. There's things like DuckDuckGo, which is a very privacy-focused search engine. Usage on that's on the rise, particularly in very tech-aware communities. So if you're writing for the tech market, you need to pay more attention to DuckDuckGo SEO. But broad, for most of us, SEO equals Google. And it's so close that as long as you're doing it well on Google, you're probably going to do fine on the other search engines. Just to give you an idea, these are most recent figures I could find from Chartbeat. They used to do this more readily. We can give you the sense of the total traffic across Chartbeat sites. Chartbeat's an analytics package, a real-time analytics package in use by a lot of the big newsrooms. And you can see that across there, they are seeing Google search, certainly since sometime just before 2017, Google transitioned to being bigger than Facebook again. So it's a big thing. More recently, the search patterns around the 2019 general election, we saw search and social almost neck and neck as for how people got their news. Within the last throes of the election, social completely eclipsing it, which is quite interesting and reverse of what we normally see around politics. But just reference for you. Why did Google come to dominate? Because I don't know how old people are attending, but some of you might be old enough to remember the days before Google, the days of Alta Vista or Excite or Lycos or Ask Jeeves. My brother and sister-in-law were the very last people I knew to abandon Ask Jeeves for Google because they were utterly convinced it was a more upmarket search engine, which means they succumbed completely to marketing. But Google came along in the late 90s, early 2000s, and dominated the market very fast. And that was because they had an insight that none of the previous search engines had had. There's this good book called In the Plex by Stephen Levy, which tells the story of the early 10 years of Google. It's worth reading, but it's an entertaining story. It's an interesting business story. It forms a lot of what's happened since. But one of the things that he mentions is the two guys who came up with the Google algorithm, called Sergey Brin and Larry Page, were academics, and they actually went and pitched it to all the other search engines, who pretty much all went, "Nah, we're good, thanks," which doesn't go down as one of the great business decisions of our time. It's like all the music companies that turned down the Beatles. All the previous search engines were doing basically the same thing. They were looking at a page like this, and they were analyzing the text. And once you chuck away all the conjunctions and prepositions and just look at the major words on the page, they do something called keyword density analysis. And that basically just means the more often a word is used, the more likely it is to be relevant to the article. So essentially just word counting. And when you typed in your search query, the search engines looked at the words you used and they returned the pages with the highest densities of those terms. That worked well in the early stages of the internet, but there were two really big problems with it. Problem one was it worked well when there's a couple of 100,000 pages or a couple of million pages on the internet. Once you get to billions of pages, it just breaks because you have so many pages with matching keyword density. How do you tell them apart? But it also breaks because it was easily manipulated. There's an old joke which runs, how many SEOs does it take to change a light bulb? Light bulb, light bulb, light bulb, light bulb, light bulb, light bulb, 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 light, change, light bulb, 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 Sussex, etc. They just keyword stuff the page. The more often you keyword stuff the page, the higher it would rank. Worryingly, there's a fish restaurant not terribly far from where I live, just down there, that until very recently had a web page with a suspiciously blank space at the bottom of it. If you visited on a desktop or a laptop and highlighted that space at the bottom, you saw variations of Sussex Fish Restaurant repeated multiple times, which is sort of terrifying because that hasn't worked for about 15 years in Google. So somewhere in Sussex, there's a web design agency that's working on 15-year-old SEO knowledge. It's active. If you do that sort of trickery now, you are actively penalized for it. But keyword thinking used to be really at the heart of SEO and has been until relatively recently. I'll come back to that in a bit. What Google realized, their big insight, which is what they ended up calling PageRank. PageRank is a terrible joke, by the way, because as I mentioned before, the founders of Google were Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Larry Page, PageRank. PageRank is Page's algorithm for ranking pages. That's what passes for humor in Google's HQ. So there must be a laugh a minute there. Anyway, what they realized was you actually need to know two things to make a good search engine. You needed to know what the page was about, which is, they got that by analyzing the words on the page. They still use that, still do to some degree. But they realized you also needed to know how good the page was. And this was their key insight. How do you tell how good a page is? Well, they just nicked from academic publishing again, just as Tim Berners-Lee had done for Google, the web rather. If you publish a scientific paper or an academic paper, different journals have different impact factors. So, for example, my wife's a molecular biologist, and in her field, you get a paper published in Nature, which she hasn't managed. But if you get a paper published in Nature, that's the top of the tree. That's the highest impact factor. And there are other perfectly fine journals, like the Journal of Salivary Immunology, which she has been published in the middle of the impact factor rankings, and then some down the bottom. But over time, that's not what matters. What matters is the number of citations you get, the number of other people who cite your work in theirs. And they just nicked that idea. Basically said, if we can scrape the entire web, we can count every link into a page as a vote. The more often a page is linked to, the better it must be, because that's effectively more sites voting for it. And that was really the heart of PageRank. And this worked well enough that Google suddenly became much, much better than all the other search engines. The problem is, again, it was manipulable. People can set up whole link farms, as they're called, create fake links to sites, charge them £10,000. SEO ranking goes through the roof. So one of the reasons why search engines keep evolving is because there's this arms race. There's an arms race between those who manipulate search engines and the search engines themselves to try and keep good results for the users. Because if they don't give us good results, we won't go back. And particularly with Google, they can't show us ads because Google's business model is still showing us ads. So they want to give us a good result, so we keep using it, so we keep seeing ads, so they keep making shed loads of money. They'll do their best to deal with manipulation as they go along. So for example, I talked about the link farming. What Google realized, sorry, PageRank, we talked about that. What Google realized after a while is that you can learn more from links than just how good a page is. If you look not just at who links to a site, but if you also look at who a site links to, you can learn from that. So if all the sites on one side, all the links coming in are from pages about surfing, and all the links the page links out to are about locations in Sussex, without looking at a single word on the page, you can probably make a guess that this page is something to do with surfing in Sussex, like best places to surf in Sussex or whatever it might be. This is the idea of neighborhoods, that actually who you link to and who links to you define neighborhoods of meaning. And that's one of the signals that Google uses. Now, in the end, it dealt with those link farmers by declaring whole chunks of the web bad neighborhoods. So if you get links from those link farms that were set up just to inflate sites' SEO ranking, then you are eventually penalized for it. Anyone who's listening who's run a website or who's running websites about between 5 and 10 years ago probably got regular emails asking them to remove links that they had on their site to other sites. And that was people desperately trying to recover from SEO penalties when they'd taken advantage of these link building schemes to boost their SEO. In fact, one of the big challenges was that the SEOs, once they realized their link farms were no use for pointing at their client's site, realized they could point them at their client's competitors' sites and destroy their client's competitors' ranking. That worked for about 3 months. It was called negative SEO. And eventually Google twigged to this and made corrections for it. But it took them a little while, and that's the level of arms race. General advice, don't get involved in those sorts of schemes. The SEO world almost explicitly divides itself into white hat SEO and black hat SEO. The language allegedly comes from old black and white cowboy movies where the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black hats. I'm not particularly comfortable with the language myself, but there you go. Everything I teach you here is unashamedly what you would call white hat SEO, because it stays within the rules. If you stay within the rules, you are less likely to suffer penalties down the line. The penalties for breaking the rules can be quite dramatic in terms of penalization. And what then tends to happen is you end up in a battle where you get a huge boost from using an abusive SEO technique. Then Google catches on and your traffic crashes. And then you search another technique and you get a huge boost and then it crashes, and you're constantly riding this wave. If you stick to good fundamental principles, hopefully, generally speaking, things will never get too bad one way or another. One of the really big changes, though, came about 5 years ago. And this is what I really want to emphasize today and what I want you to emphasize in your work. So what used to happen when you when you search for something is you typed your keywords into the Google search box. Those keywords were fed into the search algorithm, and out popped what in jargon terms we call a SERPs, just a search engine results page, SERP. Out popped a search engine results page. Bingo. It is worth saying that there is no such thing as the front page of Google anymore. If an editor strides over to you and goes, I want us to be on the front page of Google for this, you need to tell them you can't guarantee that anywhere. Certainly, if somebody comes to you and says, I can get you to rank on the front page of Google for this search term, you should, metaphorically speaking, throw them out the building. Why? Because every search results page is personalized. You can get two people sat next to each other doing the same search on different computers and getting different results. Because it personalizes around your own search behavior in the past and various other factors, including geographic. Sometimes when I've been teaching these sorts of things in-house at a publishing company, I'm able to demonstrate this quite well by getting them to search for things they write about on their computers in their offices. I did this at Telegraph, for example, once, and lots of their content comes up. I then do the same search on my iPad on the 4G network, and very little of their content comes up. That's because Google has learned that people in the Telegraph's office like looking at Telegraph content, so it shows them more of them. What's interesting is I ran that course for about 6 months, and by about 3 months in, I couldn't do that exercise anymore because Google had learned I was looking at a lot more content from that newspaper, so it was showing more of it in my search results. And it took about 2 years before that wound down again afterwards. However, this is not how Google works anymore. If you're doing paid search, i.e. you're paying to advertise against keywords, then keywords are still important. Keywords are less important for search than they used to be, because Google realized it had to change. It had to change because of two things. It had to change because mobile was coming, and it became very evident that everything was going to transition towards a mobile-dominated world. More searches are now done on mobile than are done on desktop. So mobile ranking and mobile speed are really important. But it also had to change because social had risen. And what social had done is it had nicked a whole bunch of what search used to do. What search, pre-social, if you wanted to read something on the internet, you basically had two choices. You either went direct to a site you were familiar with, or you Googled for something to read. And certainly back in the early 2000s, you would sometimes find me literally just sitting there Googling around a subject looking for something interesting to read. Those days are very long gone because social is pushing me content to read all the time. So I very rarely turn to a search engine just for something to read. Why do I turn to a search engine? Because I have a question or a problem I want solved. So that's part of it. The other part is there is a growing area of search that isn't done using keywords in the traditional sense. And I could say the words that, depending on which phone you have in front of you, or which device you're in front of you, would make a whole mess of it. I could say, hey, blah, or something along those lines, and trigger the voice search on your phone. Voice search is a growing thing. Depending on what age you are, you might use it more or less. My 7-year-old daughter just walked past. Thankfully, didn't come in. I didn't end up in one of those clips from the BBC News. And she uses voice search a lot because she's been able to do searches before she could type. When you do a voice search, what you don't go is artisan, coffee shop, Newcastle. You go, where's a good coffee shop around here? You talk in these sort of natural questions. And indeed, most people, when they turn to a search engine these days, they are not, even if they're typing in keywords, what they're actually thinking is, I've got a question or I've got a problem. So actually what happens with Google now is quite different. You type in keywords. So if you're doing a traditional desktop or mobile search rather than a voice search, you type in keywords. Those keywords, they get passed off to two weird named tools called RankBrain and BERT. What they are, apart from badly named, is machine learning algorithms. So they've used machine learning techniques to analyze people's behaviors, what they type in, what they mean by what they type in, what sort of results they're looking for. And essentially what those algorithms are doing is starting to break the link between the keywords and what you get returned to you. Because what they're trying to interpret is your intent. What do you mean by those keywords? So to give the example I gave before, they're saying, when I type in artisan coffee shop Newcastle, they know I want to find a good coffee shop somewhere near me. As long as the device knows I'm in Newcastle, which if I'm on my phone, it does because it's got GPS attached. So what they're seeking to do is actually to understand your intent. So this is the big change we've gone through the last few years. We've gone from keyword-centric search to intent-centric search. So what happens now is you type in your keywords, those are passed through those algorithms. Those algorithms intuit, if you like, your intent, and then it gives you search results based on that. What does this mean for us as journalists? What this means is, when you are looking at an article, you need to have a sense of why would somebody come to this article? What question does it answer for them? And what problem does it solve? And if you can answer that, then and this is why psychology, I think I would argue that search engine optimization is 50% technical knowledge, understanding how to optimize a page, but it is 50% psychological. It's be able to think yourself into people's heads. Why? Well, in the end, even if you get all the technical bits right, and you appear on that search engine results page down the bottom of the screen there, you're in a competitive landscape. There's anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen other headlines there in different forms. You are fighting for the attention, for the click of the reader. And that's where the psychology comes into play. And the place where you display your understanding of psychology is in the headline. Well, very technically, depending on your CMS, it's something called the page title or the SEO head. This is the bit that actually appears in the search engine results page. So this is the most important, believe it or not, this is one of the, if your article is an article that's likely to attract a lot of readers from search, this is one of the most important pieces of writing you will do on that article. Because your sales tool for this article is the page title of the SEO head, your headline, essentially. If your CMS just has a single headline field, it's going to be that headline. If it has an SEO headline field or a page title field, depends on the CMS, then you can customize them. And it's useful to have it. I use a CMS called Ghost currently, which has separate SEO, it has separate headline fields for the main, for the headline for the page, but also one for search, one for Twitter, one for Facebook, multiple headline fields. And that's one of the great skills for audience engagement, is actually thinking about headlining in a way that attracts attention. Anyway, how do you write a great headline for search? The most important, there's three things you need to think about. The first of which is context, or rather specifically, the lack of context. Because a headline, as soon as it is stripped away from the page and shoved into a search engine results page, is stripped of context. A lot of our traditional skills of writing for a magazine or a newspaper, of writing headlines for a magazine or newspaper, are based on context. To give you an example of that, I am going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Hello again, everybody. I'm going to show you a magazine. It's just a magazine I happen to have laying around. It is the latest, not quite the latest issue, it's last month's issue of Coast magazine. I live by the sea, what can I say? For example, can-do attitude. Now, that headline makes sense because you can see the photos which tell you it's about food and cooking. Everything about the page screams at you, this is a recipe page. You know the shorthand of design that tells you it's a recipe page. Then you start reading the Stanfords, which says, if you're doing that with the tinned fish in the cupboard, there's the pun, can-do attitude. Great, works brilliantly in print. But you look at the headline, you look at the picture, you're sucked in, you read the stand first. The problem is, you take that headline, can-do attitude, and you stick it on a search results page when you're looking for tinned fish recipes. And in a couple of milliseconds that you have to look at that, you're not going to click on it. You're going to click on something that says tinned fish recipes. So that lack of context is a real problem for traditional approaches. Let's go back to my exciting presentation. Now you've had enough of me waving magazines at you. So being stripped of context, what do you need instead? Well, you sometimes hear people talk about writing headlines for search as making them boring or writing them for a machine. Neither of those things is true. You don't want to be the boring headline in those half dozen or dozen headlines because you're not going to get a click. Equally, you're not actually writing for the machine at all. You're writing for the human being sat in front of the screen going, that one. So you need to have clarity. People need to be able to look at the headline and know what they're getting. But, so something like that, can-do attitude, they don't know what they're getting. Great recipes for tinned fish, they know what they're getting. There is a danger in going too far into clarity, which is sometimes you can end up giving away the story. There was some research floating around a couple of days ago that a very large proportion of Google searches don't turn into a click to a website now. That people just go to the search results page and look at the information there and never click through to anywhere else. That's partially because Google is intentionally doing that sort of thing. One of the things about optimizing for questions or problems is don't optimize for questions or problems that can be answered in a couple of words, because Google is probably going to do that for you eventually if it hasn't already done it. So you want something that's got clarity, but if you have too much clarity, you have a real danger of giving away the story. So, for example, I want to know who won Wimbledon back when there was a Wimbledon and we actually had sporting events. So I would type in, who won Wimbledon? And if the first couple of headlines I read are some variation on Andy Murray wins Wimbledon, I don't really have an incentive to click, do I? Because you've just told me the answer to my question. It's not directly the same thing, but push notifications have exactly the same problem. In fact, the exact winning Wimbledon example was one that stuck in my mind because of a push notification rather than search. Because I remember once I was wandering down the street somewhere and I got my phone to the BBC News alert sound. I thought, oh, what dramatic thing has happened? And I went, person X has won Wimbledon. I went, oh, that's very interesting. And I put the phone straight back in my pocket. Because it just told me a fact. There was nothing there that enticed me, drew me to click through. So the second element that headline needs is an element of curiosity, something that makes me curious, that makes me want to click through and learn more about what we're talking about. So, for example, it'd be something like Andy Murray wins Wimbledon in close fought final. Oh, why was it close fought? Click. You've got the click, you've got the traffic. And with our stepping back from our SEO heads to our audience engagement heads, the advantage of that is now you've got them to the site. Once you've got them to the site, you can do all sorts of interesting things with them. You can sign them up for newsletters. You can get them to subscribe to a podcast. One of the big underlying things about audience engagement is stopping seeing SEO and social as ends in their own right. It's thinking in a more joined up way. Okay, we brought them in by search. Can we move them into a more direct relationship with us? And a newsletter, for example, is a more direct relationship because we're sending directly into them. It's less filtered by algorithms than somebody who's clicked a like button on Facebook is, for example. So that's the key. Clarity, curiosity. Some technical bits as well. For example, you do need to know what the keywords of the story are. Keywords not necessarily in a traditional search sense, but what are the key ideas in the story? For example, something that's a little bit topical for you: face masks, shops. People in Scotland are used to this. If there's anybody from Scotland in, hello, love Scotland, grew up there. Those who are south of the border, just getting used to this now. This is the sort of search query that's shot up in the last few days. Face masks, shops. The thing is, when people look at a search results page, what they don't do, and eye tracking studies show this, what they don't do is read each individual headline one at a time. What they do is they scan up and down the beginning of the headlines. I was told off a couple of years ago when I was running an SEO course. So I used to say the left-hand side of the headlines. And somebody quite rightly pointed out to me that not all languages read left to right. Some languages read right to left. So the same applies the other way around if you're working a language that reads the other way. So that's why I've moved to saying beginning of the headline. People scan up and down the beginning of the headline, and they tend to click through almost without conscious intervention when they see things that match with what they typed. So I typed face mask shops, and actually right up near the top there, the Guardian headline says, face masks to be compulsory in shops in England. Okay, that tells me that I need to know a face mask, but I've still got an element of curiosity. There's a little tag on there that it runs out, UK death. UK death what? Click. And that's how you get the click. Because if you look at quite a lot of the other headlines, they're not as good. I'd really think unfair to expect police to I'm not going to read that because I don't even know what that's about. I am 7 or 8 words. You don't even get the whole of face masks into the search results. No good. Not going to click on that one. Coronavirus latest news. Matt Hancock admits face masks. That's probably SEO optimized. That and the BBC one below it are both optimized towards coronavirus searches, though, rather than face mask searches. If you want to grab the actual search traffic, the surge in search traffic for those terms, you want to go with face masks somewhere up near the beginning there, and shops as close into it as you can manage. And so there what happens is you get that point of intersection, people see the words that they typed in, you read along, you get the headline. So that's one of the core skills of search. Being able to articulate what question does my article solve? Sorry, what question does my article answer, or what problem does it solve? And then prove that to the reader in the page title, the SEO headline, or the headline, depending on how your CMS works. So used to doing things in front of rooms of people rather than into Zoom. So part of me wants to go, is that clear to everyone? If you've got a problem, if you've got a question, I believe Ian's got the chat set up, so stick the questions in there and I'll come back to them at the end of this presentation. There are lots of structural elements that make a difference as well, because you're not only trying to make the reader understand your page, you also have to make Google understand your page. And Google has lots of things that it looks for as signals of quality. Go right back to the beginning where we talked about how Google started. Those links in were the first signals of quality it used. And then it started using links as a signal of meaning. So everything Google does is looking for signals of meaning and signals of quality. A lot of those you can't control. You can't control directly who links to you. You can't control directly how many links you have. All you can do is write content that's so good that people want to link to it. Equally, one ranking signal these days is social media shares. The more shared something is, the more likely it is to do well in search. So there is an interplay between search and social there. But again, you can't control. You can set up conditions that, and if we get time today, we might talk a little bit about that. You can set up conditions where it is more likely that people will share content, but you can't directly control it. Unless you've invented the great orbital mind control laser, you can't make people do it. So that's not directly within your ability to influence. You need to be aware of it, you need to think about it, but you can't directly control it. What you can control is your own page. And there are some things that Google takes as a signal of quality of somebody who's paying attention to the page. For example, subheads, not widely used by everybody, but Google quite genuinely use subheads as a signal of quality. If you break up your content with subheadings or cross-headings, depending on how you use the phrase, that is seen by Google as a signal of quality. Why? Well, because what the research shows is that subheads make it easier to read long articles. See what seems to be going on, and this is very pop psychology for which I apologize, but what seems to be going on is that the human brain is naturally quite lazy, for good reasons, because it consumes a lot of resources when we're thinking hard. And therefore, there's always a little invisible voice in the back of our head going, are you sure you want to read that? That looks like very hard work. Look at all those words. Oh, look, you scrolled and there's even more words. And that's quite hard to get through. If you give people a smaller amount of text to look at in any one go, they're much more likely to read a long article than if they have large blocks of text to read. It's the difference between a paperback book. I mean, paperback books are fantastic technology. You never get confronted with too many words at once, and you end up sort of reading, oh, hey, and suddenly it's 3 in the morning and you wish to have the sequel. Maybe that's just me. But there's certainly good reason why paperback books have been successful, because they don't show too much text at one time, whereas big textbook, wham, oh God, do I have to read this? It's challenging to us. Okay, big slabs is actually, interestingly, it's one of the reasons why mobile phones have worked very well as reading devices for long form content. Everyone assumed mobiles would all be about short snackable content. That hasn't necessarily proved to be true. There's plenty of evidence that people will read long form stuff on phones because they don't see too much of it in one go, as an aside. Anyway, subheads are a sign of people who's paying enough attention to their content that they're breaking it up to make it legible to the reader. They have to be properly done as subheads. So in an HTML sense, that means they have to be marked up as an H2 or an H3. In your CMS, if you use WordPress, for example, that's a heading 2 or a heading 3. They can't just be bolded text, because from Google's point of view, that's just text. However, once you know that, write them for the readers, not for Google. What you don't want to do is write there, "Hello Google, this is about that." But equally, you don't want to write them in the old print style of 1 or 2 words. You really want to write them as mini headlines for the section that's coming. Sum up what's going to happen in the section that's coming. So it gives people sort of signposting through the article, if you like. And make sure they use the keywords. Yeah, make sure that between the headline, a couple of other places I'll come back to in a minute, all of the most important words in the story are used once or twice. Not repeatedly, but yeah, enough that it is discernible to Google what your key ideas are. So that's people, places, events, organizations. I'll probably get hung up on what is a keyword. A keyword is just a person, a place, an event, an organization, anything like that. What are the most important ideas in your story? Those are your keywords. It's really as simple as that. And their use on longer articles is a signal of quality for Google. It's worth saying that it is much harder to optimize short content for Google than it is to optimize long content for Google. Since something called the Panda update about 10 years ago, Google much prefers longer articles to shorter articles. There's some exceptions here around the way Google News operates, but broadly speaking, you're talking about a sort of minimum of 300 words and preferably quite a lot more to do really well in the Google main index. And that has all sorts of implications. For example, if you're sticking a video on a page, you want about 300 words of supporting content to support that video, because Google is still, it probably has the technology, but it's not widely deploying it. It's still not doing a lot of analysis within a picture or a video to inform the meaning of the page. So you have to have the words on the page for Google to get sort of to grips with it. That'll probably change over time, but right now that is definitely the case. There are lots of other factors involved here. I don't want to go into them in great depth, but I'll highlight some of the biggest ones. There's something called alt text. I was about to say, now what is alt text? But none of you can reply, so there's no point in doing that, is there? Sorry. What is alt text? Alt text is alternative text. It's a box in your CMS that's attached to a picture. It is the text that a picture will get that, sorry, just checking the chat box. It's the alternative text. Those of you who are old enough to remember the very early days of the internet might remember when you loaded a web page over dial-up and you'd get the text. Everyone over a certain age is laughing now. When you'd get the text, and then you get a box where in about 3 or 4 minutes time the photograph might arrive, and in that box would be the text. That's the alt text. Google uses the alt text to understand the picture. If the picture is well chosen for its relevance to the story, that helps Google understand what the whole story is about. And it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That if you've used a picture of something in the story, there's a fair chance that is relevant to the story. Therefore, it's a good source of information for Google to understand what your story is about. However, you should fill in your alt text. You should remember it's for Google, but that is not the main reason that you should do it. Look at me getting all stern here. The main reason you should do it is nothing to do with Google at all. It's for accessibility reasons. For the blind or the partially sighted, alt text is what their screen readers, which they use to access the web, gives them to support their understanding of the page. And so actually you do it for accessibility reasons and you get the Google benefits for free. That is actually not a coincidence. Google is using the fact you're taking the time to fill in the alt text as a signal of quality. Yeah, this is a high quality site that makes the effort to fill in alt text. That's why it works. There was one of our national newspapers that had a site architect who's behind some of the tech of the site, who was indeed very partially sighted. And they used to apparently wander the newsroom floor periodically and metaphorically clip around the ear people who hadn't been filling the alt text in on their stories, because they could hear it very clearly as they use the screen reader to help them access the site. So that's one thing to think about. Your first paragraph's quite important as well. Google analyzes the first paragraph for meaning. So any core ideas that aren't in your headline probably should be in your first paragraph. This is bad news to people like me, because particularly in my print days, I was a huge fan of the long drop intro, or as the chief sub of the magazine used to say, taking 3 bloody paragraphs to get to the point, Tinworth. But yeah, it was creative writing. It was great journalism on the features front, honestly. Yeah, you need to get to the point. A lot of sites, well, interestingly, the web doesn't have a concept of a stand first. There is no HTML markup for a stand first. So a lot of time when you see a stand first on a web page, it's actually a italicized body copy. So it is the first paragraph essentially. And that allows you to get all the key ideas into the first paragraph and then go back to writing beautifully florid long drop intros like I used to do. There are some technical things which you need to be aware of even if you can't directly control. Page loading speed is really important. There's a classic example of one of the things that Google pays a lot of attention to. When Google introduces something like this, it tends to introduce it at a very low level and then dial it up over time. So when they first introduced page loading speed as a ranking metric, it wasn't that important. But over the years, it's become more and more important. This is one reason to think about this is it's really important to remember that search is a competitive game. You are competing to have a better written headline that ranks higher in Google than your competitors. So actually, your absolute page loading speed isn't really as important as how you compare to your competitors. There's a tool you can find just by Googling called Page Speed Insights. If you don't stick your homepage in, because homepages are all incredibly slow to load anyway, because they're full of stuff. Stick an article in from your site or the site you're working out. Stick an article in from a competitor, see how their page load speeds compare. If you're way slower than your competitor, you have a problem. Now, you might not be directly in your power to fix it, but it's the sort of thing you need to talk to your technical team or anybody else about making sure that's fixed. There's in fact a big update coming to Google Search early next year. That's about page experience. They have a page experience tool that's largely defined around providing a good mobile optimized experience that's likely to have a dramatic impact on a lot of search ranking early next year. When they flag things up to us like this well in advance, it generally means it's going to be big. I made reference to the Panda update of over a decade ago, earlier on. That was what was called the content quality update. To give you an example of how dramatic it was, I know the day it happened because the company I was working for had a business that was built on lead generation. So it had a lot of very cheap, very nasty copy, frankly, about office supplies. It was highly keyword optimized. It was sort of thing, do you want an office photocopy? If you want an office photocopy is good to have. That sort of repetitive keyword optimized nonsense. That was basically just designed to attract search traffic and get people to fill in forms, and those forms could be sold on to people who produce photocopies, for example, for a decent amount of money. So it's pretty much for every 1,000 views they got on the site, 100 of them was fill in forms, 80 of them were sellable. So they could translate search traffic straight into money until literally 90% of, I think 95% of their traffic disappeared overnight. And that was the night the Panda update hit. And it said quite rightly, this content is shockingly bad. Why am I showing it to searchers? And actually, again, just taking a step back from SEO to audience engagement broadly, one of the really important things to remember is search is only one tool for attracting people. There is social, there are newsletters, there are podcasts, there are all sorts of other ways of there is direct engagement with people. You never ever want to build a business that is entirely dependent on Facebook or Google or any other algorithmically sorted service, because then you don't actually own your journalism business. You don't own your audience. You are loaned your audience by Facebook or Google. And that's why so much audience engagement now is not just about getting people in via search and getting people in via social. It's about what you do with them after you've got them. Just wanted to flag that up because it's so important to most things. It's where so many journalism businesses have stumbled over the last 10 years, particularly around sort of 7 to 8 years ago, when everyone just basically gave up on most of the other audience engagement techniques they were doing, and they concentrated instead on just shoving stuff on Facebook. I used to, back when I had a proper job, back when I used to work for a journalism organisation, I used to go and give guest lectures at Cardiff University every year. And I was talking to the chap who used to organise those about a year back, and he was saying, yeah, it was great, but just after you stopped doing them because you were no longer working in a company, we had to stop the series. And I said, why? Well, before, we had all sorts of people coming in, the local papers were talking about all the interesting stuff they were doing about engaging with their audiences, and the B2B titles were talking about this, and the consumer mags were doing this, and the national papers were doing that. And then within a couple of years, everyone just came in and said, oh yeah, we shove all our stuff on Facebook. We've got 59 minutes left in this lecture. What else do you want me to say? And it sort of lost its interest. And then a lot of businesses suffered off the back of that. Same applies to search. You know, you want search to be part of your audience acquisition mix, but you don't want it to dominate it. User experience, that's where I've just flagged up. User experience is going to become more important. Google has tools on that on their website now where you can analyze your page's user experience. It is something to pay attention to in the coming months. I'll talk about length. Length is important for search in two ways. First of all, just because Google prefers longer form content, because longer form stuff is more likely to have the answers a searcher is looking for. But also because of engagement. Oh, it's that word again. Ironically, for somebody who spends much of his time working on user engagement, I sort of hate the word engagement. It used to be a really useful word because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was talking about the difference between digital and print, it made sense that people could engage with you through digital. But these days, you go and talk to a publisher and they say, yes, I want more engagement on the site, please. You say, okay, what do you mean? Well, engagement. No, but what do you mean by engagement? Do you want more people coming to the site via search or social? Do you want them to spend longer on the site when they're there? Do you want them to consume more pages on the site when they're there? Do you want them to move from search to a newsletter? What do you mean by engagement? Do you want them to join in comments discussions? And they go, engagement, and walk off. You realize, okay, you've picked up a buzzword and you haven't really thought this through. Google has a very specific meaning for engagement. If a user comes from search to your page and very quickly bounces back to Google, that's what Google terms low engagement. And if that happens a lot, that will tend to drive down your search ranking. This happens actually quite a lot with short news stories, which don't have any obvious links at the end of the article to push you onto other things. So actually internal linking really quite genuinely is a useful search strategy to keep people moving through your site. Also, actually, believe it or not, internal links are essentially low-level votes for other pieces of content. So it helps Google find its way around and index the stuff that's on your site. One I haven't put on the slides, actually, but which is really important, and I'm now kicking myself for not putting them on the slides, sorry, is something called freshness. And this is probably one of the biggest SEO concepts that's a real challenge to those of us from a more traditional journalistic background. Because freshness postulates that all other things being equal, the more recently published or updated article is likely to be the better result. What this means in effect is that you publish something on your site. Your site has a default, has something called domain authority. Your site will have a certain baseline ranking in Google for a particular subject. Domain authority is based on subject. So if you write about trains, your site will have a basic domain authority on trains or green ecology or coronavirus research or whatever it might be. It'll have the default ranking in that, and every page you publish on that subject will get that default ranking. As you accumulate signals of quality, like links, like shares, that authority will grow over time, meaning your page ranking gets higher. After a while, people will stop sharing it, people will stop linking to it. That will sort of stabilize. What will happen under the freshness is that after a while, it will start to decline as soon as other people start publishing things on a similar topic. That's quite niche, so it won't be as broad as coronavirus research. It'll be about specific antibody research or whatever it might be. Which means if you have high-ranking pages on your site, you need to update them. This is quite a weird concept for a lot of journalists, because the thing about print is it's quite hard to update unless you want to run around the country with a lot of pens writing on lots of magazines. So we're not used to updating content. It's not a stored process. But a lot of search strategy is about thinking about evergreen content which has a long life, which answers questions, which solves problems, which is not necessarily news in the traditional sense, although often things grow out of it. In fact, just a few years back, I was literally walking down the stairs just over there, having put my daughters, who were then quite young, to bed for their lunch break. And my wife said, "The air show's gone really quiet." And I had that sort of sinking feeling, moment of dread, and turned to my phone and Googled Shoreham Air Show. And already the news stories were up: crash, Shoreham Air Show. So I live about a mile from the site of the Shoreham Air Show crash a few years ago, where 12 people were killed on a road. And what you saw very rapidly happen for a lot of news sites was they would have stories that read something like, "Everything we know about the Shoreham Air Show this afternoon. Everything we know about the Shoreham Air Show this morning." That's what's called a living article. It's one article which contains everything they know about it, which is updated in time. It is, if you like, the first draft of the explainer. So this article will eventually more or less calcify. So, several years on, there's very little new to say about the Shoreham Air crash. The inquiry's just wound up, so it's pretty much done as a subject. So that's now an explainer. If you want to know about the Shoreham Air crash, you Google for information on the Shoreham Air crash. You'll probably get Wikipedia first, because Wikipedia is the great source of all explainers. But lots of news organizations explain this topic will come next. But it's a good search strategy, a one-page explainer that covers everything, that may be linked back from the news stories and links to the news stories as they happen, the traditional run of news stories. Again, the sense of updated reference pages almost on subjects, explainers, stock content, some people call it. That's a deep part of your SEO strategy. And really, to just start, because I know we're nearly out of time here, just to rewind back to the beginning of where we started with the idea of pixie dust. All of this stuff, all of this sort of technical stuff we're talking about here is great, but it all works much better if right at the beginning of the process you're thinking about the search angle on any subject. So one of the co-tutors on one of the courses I teach is a lady called Sarah Marshall, who works in audience engagement at Vogue. And one of the things they do is, because they know, well, traditionally they know, things are a bit different at the moment, but traditionally in the past, they've known exactly where the big fashion shows are each year, when the Paris shows are, when the London shows are, when the New York shows are. They will get articles up and online, previews and other things like that, months and months in advance. So they start building the authority on that subject. This is why sometimes you see weird stories on national newspapers of headlines like, "What time is the Great British Bake Off final?" They're doing that more or less as an SEO flag in the sand, because people Google for that. It's an obvious question. But because they build up over months some ranking around that, 48 hours or a week before the actual thing, that page on the same URL, on the same web address, that's important, becomes something like the Great British Bake Off Final 2019 preview. And then afterwards, it may be something like everything we learned from the Great British Bake Off Final. That's a long-term SEO strategy about knowing when your big attention, back to attention, when your big peaks of attention are coming in the year. And that can be all sorts of topics, sports events. You know when the big sports events are going to be. You need to get your content, some of your initial preview content ready as early as you can, so it's building up search traffic over time. And then you can build on that and interlink on that when you've got all the content ready before a Rugby World Cup or a big Grand Prix or a general election or all of those things. The Fixed Term Parliament Act was theoretically a great boon to journalism, because we could plan for general elections and we could plan interactives and we could get our search engine optimization ready in advance, although none of the recent elections have been anywhere near the fixed term, but never mind, that's a whole other subject. So to go back to the beginning, you need to be thinking about, it's not just about the story. The story is important, the story is vital, but it's about how you're going to get an audience for that story. Not every story will work for search. Broadly speaking, the rule of thumb, the difference between search and social, is that search stories appeal to the intellect and the social stories appeal to the emotions. That's an oversimplification, but broadly speaking, that's because for search, you are articulating a problem or a question in your head, and you are turning to a search engine to type in those questions. For social, people are sharing it. Social sharing is driven by emotions largely. There are various motivations, including defining your identity and emotional gifts between friends, and to get word out about causes you're passionate about. Those are the three main sharing motivations. Stuff that tends to create an emotional reaction tends to do better on social. You do get unicorn stories, which are great on both, and we love them when they happen. And that's when it's useful having the multiple headline fields. But broadly speaking, the earlier on in the process you are thinking about how you are going to acquire an audience for the thing you are writing, the better off you're going to do. Actually, we talked about attention for the reader as being their scarce resource. In the digital age, for a journalist, your scarce resource is time. In the print days, the amount we had to produce was defined by the size of the publication, and usually by some sort of ad-ed ratio between advertising and editorial. Now we can potentially publish infinite amounts of stuff. So the limit is the amount of journalism time we have available to us. And so a lot of it's about making smart decisions about how we spend that time. And the more time you invest in thinking about acquiring an audience for your journalism, the better served, if you like, the time you invest in research and writing good journalism is likely to be. Thank you very much, everybody. I think that's all we have time for today, other than the questions. So I suspect I need to hand over to Ian to EMC.
Yes, thank you, Adam. So much great content there. Thank you, Adam, for sharing that with us. Some fantastic stuff that we've done a deep dive into search, but you've mentioned so many other things that if we had time, I would love to go even deeper into some of those. So maybe at some point, Adam will bring you back. But in the meantime, we've got half an hour for our attendees, our audience. Hopefully we've engaged our audience today, Adam. So now I'm just going to ask if you've got a question, go to the chat function, and then just post that down the post it in the chat function, and then I'll put the question to Adam. It gives Adam a chance just to take a little bit of a breath. But I just, I found that little insight just there at the end where you're talking about how to think, Adam, about how we, at the very beginning of our news gathering, even. I mean, we're used to telling our students, for instance, at the beginning of news gathering, think about, what type of media to use. Is this going to be, a story that we should tell in video or in audio or in text? But, you've just said, not just that, we should also be saying, think about, is this something we think about search and social, right from the beginning, and what kind of, is it a story that's going to appeal to the head or the emotions? So yeah, I found that really, really valuable.
It's funny enough, this is a lesson I learned an awful long time ago in print, of all places. When I took over as features editor on the States Gazette, the magazine I was on, the company I was working for also owned New Scientist. And in fact, an old university friend of mine was the editor of New Scientist. So I walked around the corner and spent some time with them. And one of the things I wanted to know is, why did New Scientist always look so gorgeous? And I realized that actually what they did was they didn't do sequential commissioning and illustration, they did parallel. So very early in the conversation about creating a feature, they brought in the art team. And so that gave them a much longer run at creating the illustrations that went with the article, and two developed in parallel. And so basically I just stole that from them. And so when we had our features planning meetings, we would also commission photography, where they get the art team involved. We commission photography, we commission illustrations, all that sort of stuff. And it radically improved the quality of the design of it. And that sort of principle of involving everybody who's involved with the whole process, from writing to delivering to selling the article as early as you can in the process, makes a difference. It really does. And journalism, it's one of those differences why journalism isn't a synonym with writing, because journalism is more than just writing. It is researching and finding the audience and connecting with the audience and understanding what they need and getting it to them.
Yes, and sorry, we've got some great questions coming in, but just to finish off that, I mean, I'm guessing that some of those jobs that I mentioned at the outset, some of those SEO editor roles, those people are in the news. They're in the news meeting right at the beginning, aren't they?
Yeah, and there's been an interesting little battle on that front over the last 15 years, in that I've seen companies that almost a tug of war between marketing and editorial over who owns things like SEO. And in most places, that has now sort of gone back, and that SEO falls under it has a marketing element to it, but it also falls under the remit of the editorial team. And you'll see the SEO experts reporting into the audience engagement team, who are normally led by a trained journalist. On the other side, the other half of audience engagement, the social side, we've been through a similar thing, but there was the early days of social where a lot of places just assumed that the young people know social, so we'll hire young people who are good at social. They don't know anything about journalism, but they know about social. And then you got all sorts of problems with big American newspapers retweeting allegations with no context, and libel suits and all sorts of exciting things like that. So that they suddenly realized there may be some journalism skills as well as some social skills were quite useful in those roles.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adam. Okay, let's dive into these questions. Anand asks, how would you differentiate between clickbait journalism and quality journalism? How can quality journalism engage audience without compromising the quality of the stories? That's a great question.
It is a great question. And you've got about 3 hours to spare, because I'm that one probably. So clickbait, clickbait's interesting. Clickbait, I talked about the context, clarity, curiosity. Clickbait is actually the fourth one of those 4 C's, if you like. Clickbait is what happens when you overdo curiosity. It's when you push the curiosity too hard. And it's very easy to do. I mean, there was a whole school of neuro clickbait, which was just about getting attention at all costs. It's that here are 37 cats that look like Stalin, and what number 17 is doing will change your life. It's that sort of stuff. And actually, yes, there are 37 cats that if you sort of squint do look like Stalin, but what 17 is doing is quite funny, but it really isn't changing my life. But what they're doing is they're playing on lots of psychological tricks there. For example, numbers in headlines listicles, those are about signaling time. They signal time. The print is really good at telling you how long an article is going to take to read, because we have all sorts of design signals that tell people it's a short article. Even, generally most print publications have short stuff at the beginning, long stuff in the middle, short stuff at the end. So where we are in the publication design cues all tell us how long things are going to take to read. The web's terrible for that. It's really bad. So I see some sites now have an estimated reading time at the top. What those numbers in headlines did was they sold you how long it's going to take. A 7 things would be a quickie. A 37 things is there's most of your lunch break. And then change your life. It's just playing on people's weaknesses of making things relevant to them. So clickbait is stuff that overpromises and underdelivers, which works very well if you don't really care about your audience. You just care about its size. So for places that are largely volume plays, that their entire business model is about getting as many eyeballs as possible, as cheaply as possible, because then it just about stacks up on the advertising. And I'd say, but places like Mail Online are very much part of that sort of operation. For them, it's just like getting the eyeballs. They don't really care about the loyalty engagement part of it, because there are always other eyeballs to get. And you do end up at that point where you're thinking, well, I can in fact believe what the original Michelle from EastEnders looks like now, and it wasn't worth clicking through 37 slides to find out. And that's the problem with that, all of that sort of stuff is it is no way of building a loyal audience. So it's great if you only care about cheaply monetized, basically eyeballs being shown crappy ads, then it's fine. If you want to build any more sustainable business model around more targeted advertising, so particularly the B2B and B2C spaces, if you are a swimming magazine, you actually want to get proper swimmers on the site who are going to buy stuff from your swimming advertisers, or who will pay for a swimming magazine subscription. In that case, you can't afford to go too deep into clickbait, because it's going to basically soil your audience pot, if you like, and therefore you have to work out where you sit on that spectrum. Without getting too deep, there's a very interesting chap on the internet called Ben Thompson. He writes a daily newsletter called Stratechery, which is a subscription newsletter. I think 4 of them are subscriber only a week, and 1 is free. And I pay $10 a month for that very happily, because he does really deep analysis on lots of stuff around tech, some of which is completely uninteresting to me, but enough of it intersects with publishing that I find irrelevant. One of the things he talks about is what he calls the smiling curve. And he says what the internet tends to do is it tends to either promote massive volume, which is the sort of Mail Online, Huffington Posts of this world, or high niche. So it's stuff in the middle that tends to fail. So if you're really playing in the high volume, low revenue space, low revenue per user space, then clickbait is almost an inevitable part of your life. It's a horrible game to play, though. Because the problem with all these clickbaity tricks is that people eventually burn out on them. Once you've got caught by 4 or 5 crappy clickbaity articles, that particular weakness in your psychology gets sort of inoculated, if you like. The other place to make money is the niche, whether that's geographical niche, subject niche. There you've got a small number of users, but you're making much more money off them, either through more targeted advertising or through running events when we can do that again, or through memberships or whatever. There you can't afford to play with clickbait, because you want to build up reader trust and loyalty, and people have to care about this sort of stuff. So the line between the two is when you cross the line, when you actually start essentially misrepresenting what you are getting, what you are giving people to just get them there. And that's the line between clickbait and quality. Quality journalism is a horribly difficult thing to define, because it needs a supplementary question is for who? What are people looking for? And different audiences have different needs. Again, one of my very early lessons on this from analytics was, for various complicated reasons, even though I wasn't working on the website, I was seeing all the analytics for one of the magazines I was on, because I was the only one who had the software that could take them into readable format. And I remember being genuinely shocked, because our newsroom's sense of what the big stories were in the industry we were covering was it was all about big money transactions. And that was not what the analytics were showing me. What the analytics were showing me is that people were reading all the people stories. So I started, I got a question from the analytics. I wasn't going to get the answer from the analytics. So I went and talked to people. So I was at industry events again, back in the old days when we got to meet people face to face. And I asked people, why? And I said, well, in all honesty to you, most of the big deals that happen in our industry, we hear about on the grapevine very quickly. That news travels by wildfire. We love having those stories in the Gazette because it feels like a journal of record, but nobody reads them. It's the gossip about, because this is such a people-driven business, and most businesses are people-driven. This is such a people-driven business. It's actually the stories you regard as a bit gossipy, who's moving where, who's working with what project. That's the stuff we really care about, plus the in-depth market research. So quality journalism, you have to understand what the readers view as quality. And that varies wildly compared if you're the Sun or the Guardian or Property Week or Wine and Spirit Gazette. They all have different sense of what quality is. Quality journalism is journalism that genuinely needs meet the information needs of the reader in some useful way, which builds a relationship between the information provider and them, as in you as the information provider. But what that looks like, I don't think there is an abstract, Socratic version of quality journalism. I think it's highly dependent on your audiences.
Great, thank you, Adam, and thank you for your question. And a couple of maybe related questions here. One from Stephanie. Stephanie says, great masterclass. If there were short articles of 200 words or less in a Q&A like section on a website, how would you improve SEO or search returns for those? Because I know you mentioned that even for a video, you need at least 300 words for Google to make sense.
It is very tough to do that sort of thing. What you might have to do is try and find a way of combining them into a longer piece on the page, to try and find a way of bringing together related ones on a page to get something a bit longer than like that. But generally those very short Q&A stuff just doesn't work. It's actually one of the big challenges is some things that work very well in print just do not translate well to digital. You know, those news in brief, those little snippety stories which fill a hole on the page and which work really well when you're physically browsing through a print thing, just don't work terribly well in digital. If I may slip into anecdote again, I was doing a workshop for a national paper, and it was a weird workshop because they had senior desk heads and interns in the same workshop and everyone in between. But rather bravely, I thought, one of the interns stuck up a hand and said, what you say is really interesting. I think I'm wasting about half a day a week. And I was like, okay, that's brave. Okay, why do you think you're wasting half a day a week? He said, because one of my jobs is to take these short articles from the weekend edition and put them online. And I've looked at the analytics and they're in single figures for a national newspaper. And I was like, really? And somebody, more senior dived in and was like, bloody hell, she's right. And the more we looked at it, we were like, actually, I can't see any way of making this. They're too short. They weren't substantive enough to work in search. They weren't amusing enough to work in social. And the more we looked at it, it's like, is anyone going to notice if we just stop putting these online? And they stopped putting them online and nobody noticed. So it does sort of raise a second question, which is, was anybody looking at it in print either? But that's a whole other conversation. So it's difficult. There's no easy answer. But generally speaking, one of the things you might want to do is try and find connecting themes and then try and aggregate them together in an article, for example.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Question from my good friend Ross here. Do you think estimated read time is a good idea, or do longer estimated read times lower click-through rates from a SERPs page?
Generally estimated reading times, thankfully, are not flagged up on SERPs. So you only tend to see them when you hit the actual page itself. So it can have an off-putting effect, yeah. Some people will, you can have the advantage that some people will save it to read later, either sort of the simple way of just leaving it open in a tab and coming back to it eventually, or for the more advanced people, save it to something like Pocket or Instapaper, both of which you'll get the analytics, you'll see that people have been there, which is good. It's why it's worth, so if you've not come across Pocket or Instapaper, they are save to read later services. They're quite useful things to register with the publisher backend. So you can see analytics on how many people are saving stuff from your sites and how long they're spending with it, which is worth doing sometimes. I think it's useful information, and it gives people some contextual understanding of whether they're getting themselves into a long haul piece or a short haul piece. And you'll sometimes get greater completions because people will say, oh, I'll put this one aside and I'll save this to read on my phone on the train home, or that sort of thing. Again, back when we were all commuting.
Okay, thank you. Evelina asks, what are the best ways or tips to get your articles shared by others? And she gives an example, obligatory masks in Catalonia. I don't know whether that's a story that Evelina has written or wants to write. But yeah, we haven't really had a chance really to talk about social in much depth.
Yeah, I'd say there's those three main sharing motivations that seem to drive people. People share things because they help define their identity. That's the one that tends to make people share articles before they've read them, because they read the headline and go, this is the sort of article I want to be seen sharing, so they share it. And actually that sort of one, because masks can be a highly divisive issue, depending on where you are in the world. America, highly divisive. Other parts of the world, less divisive. That people will share it for political reasons. So they will share it because they self-identify as a person who is a mask wearer, and that in America, for example, is highly identified with being a Democratic voter. But they'll also do it to get the word out about a cause, if it's a genuine health thing for them. So those are two of the three sharing motivations right there. The third motivation is emotional gift, where you gift an article to a friend as a part of a relationship maintenance. To give you a slightly weird example of that, I have a friend, she's godmother of my daughters, in fact, who works at the Foreign Office on anti-terrorism of all things, but she's obsessed by penguins. And I found a weird gif of a penguin walking towards somebody. He falls over, then the penguin sort of turns into a rocket, goes up and blows up the person. And I thought that's the perfect intersection of terrorism and penguins, and therefore I need to share it to her. So that was, it's the only person in the world who's worth sharing to. But that was a relationship maintenance share, if you like. So those three things are what tend to drive shares. So the first thing is, honestly, the image. Your lead for social, lead images are so important. Because if you think about social situations where people are scrolling through a social feed, the thing that stops them is an image. So you want your image to be arresting, to invoke curiosity in people, and to not look like an advert. There's so many sort of like stock shots, people shaking hands in an office, people looking serious with the mask on, can look like adverts for something or other. So you need to be careful. You need to choose an arresting, striking image to make people stop, and a headline that sells the emotional reason. So it'd be something like, the reason why you should wear a mask in Catalina, or something like that. Catalonia, rather. Catalina's an operating system. Sorry.
Thank you. Jose says, I thought it was an excellent presentation. Everything that's discussed, super easy to understand. Is there a way we can get a copy of the presentation? Yep, Adam has kindly agreed for us to record this, Jose, so I'll be able to share that with you afterwards, because you said you'd like to share it with your editorial team. Great, but Jose also mentions you can also use Lighthouse, he says, to give data about page experience. I don't know if Lighthouse is something you've come across, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of good tools, but actually thinking about page experience is becoming more and more important. Without getting too technical, it's your mobile page experience that really matters now. So from about 6 or 7 years ago, Google was running two indexes. They had an index which was based on desktop experience and an index based on mobile experience. So if you did a search on mobile, you got results from the mobile index. If you did a search on desktop, you got results from desktop index. Over the last year, they've turned one of those ones off. Guess which one?
The desktop.
Yeah. So now, even if your site performs well on desktop, it won't do well on desktop searches if it doesn't also perform well on mobile. So your mobile user experience is really, really important. So any tool you have, like Lighthouse or anything else, user experience tools, good user experience team, they're another people to get very friendly with, really important for search ranking into the future. Google as a business is very obsessed by these sorts of things. They've seen they're a very analytics driven business. They've seen that a couple of seconds delay in loading time has a big dropout rate for usage and stuff like that. So they will tend to promote sites that are a good overall user experience. But again, remember, it's all competitive. You just need to be. It's a bit like that old joke. Two people are about to be eaten by a monster, and one person starts putting on his running shoes, and the other person says, "Why put on the running shoes? You're never going to outrun that monster." Says, "I don't need to outrun the monster. I just need to outrun you." And it's a bit like that with you and your competition. You don't need to be the fastest site in the world. You just need to be faster than other people competing for the same search traffic.
Yes. Great. And Jose also says, don't forget to mention Google will be moving into mobile first indexing this September.
In fact, just what I said. In fact, it's largely moved over already. Most sites, I think virtually every site I've got access to the back end of has already moved over. It's been doing I think it's completion of a process that's been rolling out for 2 years.
And then he has a final question regarding the recent BERT update. This taught Google to understand context of the content. Do you think that in future this will affect how journalists will write stories in the future?
Probably, but not directly, if that makes sense. In the sense, all of these things are. We are still in a weirdly, we are still as a business in a transition. We are going through a very long multi-decade process of trying to disentangle journalism from print and broadcast journalism. And that there's good reasons for that, because anyone who's worked on a print magazine, particularly a weekly or a daily or anything like that, will know how brutal those deadlines are. I used to hate Easter with a passion when I worked on a weekly magazines, because that's 2 issues you only have 4 days to do instead of 5. I'd say one of the nice things about not working in a magazine anymore is I don't have to worry about bank holidays in the same way. And because of that, because these deadlines are so brutal, broadcasts even worse. You know, you can't say, and this report will be in any second now. You just can't really, can you? So these deadlines are brutal and unchanging. Because of that, we ended up encoding a lot of ways of working into our journalistic processes that were about hitting deadlines in various ways. And what are the things we're starting, and we're about the characteristics of the product, and largely about the transitory nature of the product. You know, eventually this is going to get recycled. It's not going to sit on my bookshelf for 20 years. If it does, hoarders will be coming to see me. But we're going through this long process of disentangling it. And a lot of these changes in Google, all they're doing is forcing us to be more responsive to the way people actually consume information on the web, rather than the way we assume they consume information because we come from a news-driven background. I mean, one of the big challenges of journalism is that journalists on average are about the worst people in the world to figure out how other people consume journalism. Because journalism is a competitive field, and you don't tend to get into it unless you are highly, highly passionate about things like news. Whereas the average person on the street probably cares about news about 5% of the amount we care about news. And therefore our sense of where value lies is sometimes out of whack with the reader. This idea of like older content being updated and stuff like that, which you talk about freshness, that's really hard for journalists to get their heads around sometimes, because they're so obsessed with the latest story. Whereas new to me, but interesting, is still very valuable for a lot of readers. And so the value in our archives is something that's lurking in the background. So things like understanding context, understanding why people search for things. Yes, it's already changing. You know, we've seen people change their journalism around the sort of shift to intent, and intent and context will become more important. But these are not bad things. You know, these are making our journalism more sophisticated. And as we sit in a more competitive landscape with way more content out there, one of the ways you carve out niches is by finding these interesting approaches. If you look at things like Vox over in the States, you know, they're one of the very early ones to say, okay, we're not going to do breaking news. Everybody does breaking news. We don't need to do breaking news. What we're going to do is we're going to get the first really good explainer that gives you context and contextualization, and then, you know, keep those updated. And then, yeah, people like the Times followed suit. The 2 biggest drivers of upticks in circulation to the Times for their paywall are usually contextualization events. So they, for example, after the Brexit vote, they dropped their paywall for that weekend, and basically torrents of people going, what does this mean? I'm not sure that question's even been answered yet, but that led, because they had lots of deep analysis and context setting rather than just this is what's happened. The Times has lent into this is what happened. This is how what happened fits into context and what it possibly means. That contextualization of journalism tends to drive the paywall. So they do tend to basically give people sampling opportunities around these big, you know, world-changing events, which then tends to lead to an uptick in circulation when they put the paywall back up.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes, so maybe 2 quick questions and quick answers. Adam, Peter says, great presentation, thanks. Any comments with regard to micro formats / schema within HTML to describe pages or topics?
Really important, getting more important. Very important in some spaces, like recipes, for example. If you're doing cooking, microformats and stuff is really important because it gives you a much better display. Generally, we don't have time to go into today, but the more metadata you can get on your page, the more structured data you can get on your page, all of these things make a big difference to how Google perceives you, and is likely to only get more important over time. Some of this structured data stuff is getting really interesting. I think we probably lost half the people there, but I'm very glad somebody's out there paying attention to it. This is machine readable data that's not necessarily viewable to the human eye, but which again gives all sorts of interesting ability to connect up stuff and contextualize stuff. It's going to become more important. It's one of these things that's been hovering around in the background for some years, but when it finally hits properly, it has a lot of potential to do stuff. I had a question directed to me, which can I answer this one?
Yeah.
What's the best way to attract traffic to a website that's predominantly video content rather than articles or written content? Two things to that. The first one is to remember that the second biggest search engine in the world is YouTube. And so actually YouTube specific SEO or optimizing around YouTube is a whole separate but related topic. There's an awful lot of people will go to YouTube to do their search rather than Google because they're looking for videos that answer things. If you are optimizing a website around videos, that's a bit more tricky, but it's about putting the contextualization and cross-connecting. So you need those 300 to 400 words of supporting content if you want to drive people to a website, but you need to flag up this video in there. That's why you see a lot of people using the headlines like video : blah, 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 just to draw people's eyes who are looking for videos. It's less common than it used to be because Google is tending to flag up videos directly in search results now as a separate box within the page, in which case you probably need to be in YouTube. There's some evidence that Google actually, just a story in the last 24 hours, that Google has been caught out favoring YouTube in video search results over Facebook or Vimeo or any of the other hosting places. So that is worth bearing in mind.
Great, thank you. That was another question I had spotted at the end, but also just very quickly from Yang Chiu, I'd like to ask Adam if he has any advice for a young journalist when they're first building up their blog or social media account. Any quick thoughts about just, I guess, finding an audience and engaging with them?
Best one is find a niche. Find a subject, find a niche, find the people who are in that niche, build a community around it. So the simple things like interview people, then they are going to promote it. They'll help you embed within their things, bring community content in there, make the community part of your journalism. Community informed journalism is really important way of building loyalty. The European Journalism Centre have got something called the Engaged Journalism Accelerator. If you Google around Engaged Journalism Accelerator, they have a lot of resources on their website and also on Medium that talk a lot about methods of sort of engaging an audience, of building and bringing an audience in. That's a really good starting place for resources. So basically choose a niche, identify people, and then build up stuff around those people and draw them into what you're doing.